Welcome to this explainer. So, if you've ever wanted to really understand why our modern world looks, sounds, and even trades the exact way it does today, we've got to rewind. We are heading back to a massive historical period that quite literally redrew the global map. We're talking about 5 centuries of unprecedented, game-changing global transformation.
Here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll define the era, then look at the driving motivations. After that, we'll map out the key global focus areas, dig into the imperial impact, and finally, wrap up with post-World War II decolonization.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, defining the era and the foundation of global empires.
500 years, 5 empires, 1 transformed world. It's honestly kind of impossible to overstate the immense scale of this. I mean, at its peak, the British Empire alone claimed roughly a quarter of the Earth's entire land surface. We are looking at half a millennium of history that completely rewired global demographics, economies, and politics from the ground up.
So the colonial era spans roughly from the 15th all the way to the 20th century. At its core, this whole period was absolutely dominated by European powers engaged in a massive, relentless pursuit, seizing global territories. And look, the goal wasn't just expansion for the sake of drawing a bigger map. It was highly strategic. They were aggressively going after raw resources, distinct trade advantages, and absolute economic control.
So, who were the actual architects of this era? Well, the driving force really came down to 5 major European powers: Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. Looking outward from their coastal borders, these 5 maritime nations kicked off a wave of unprecedented expansion that would eventually touch pretty much every single continent on Earth.
Moving on to part 2, the driving motivations. What was the actual catalyst for all this expansion?
Well, this explosion outward wasn't triggered by just one single factor. It was really a perfect storm of 3 distinct drivers. First up, political competition. You had these empires fiercely vying against one another for total global dominance. Second was economic gain, specifically the desperate need for raw materials and entirely new markets to fuel their growing wealth. And third, the push for religious conversion. Together, those 3 elements locked into place to create a really powerful, almost unstoppable engine for expansion.
To really grasp that religious motivation, we have to look at the doctrine of discovery. This wasn't just some casual belief floating around. It was a formal religious justification used to actively legitimize the seizing, colonizing, and conversion of indigenous lands. In the eyes of these empires, this doctrine provided the ultimate moral and legal framework to just claim territories far from home.
Let's move to part 3, key global focus areas. This is where we look at the actual map of control.
Now, the absolutely crucial thing to understand here is that not all colonies were run the same way. Not even close. Britain's focus in the Americas led to the establishment of the 13 colonies, right? Meanwhile, Spain and Portugal were also zeroed in on the Americas, places like Brazil and the Caribbean, but their imperial method relied heavily on massive plantation systems. Then, as these European nations turned their eyes toward Africa and Asia, the method shifted entirely to subjugating huge territories through direct administrative control.
Really, the geography largely dictated the method of control. On one hand, over in the Americas, you had plantation systems intensely focused on agricultural resource extraction. But on the other hand, in Africa and Asia, you saw administrative subjugation. Over there, the primary goal was controlling vast, already existing populations and established infrastructures. Why? To efficiently extract raw materials and completely dominate local trade.
Let's look at India as a fascinating mini-narrative of how these control methods evolved over time. The colonization of India didn't actually start with the British government itself. It literally started with a corporation. The British East India Company arrived in the 18th century. But by 1858, following some massive unrest, we see a really sharp escalation straight to direct imperial rule by the British Crown. This whole period, known as the British Raj, lasted nearly a century until 1947.
Which brings us to part 4, the imperial impact. The reality of transformation and subjugation. The reality for the original inhabitants of these regions was, frankly, devastating. This era saw the widespread forced displacement of native communities and systematic exploitation by colonizers. A major driver of this was mercantilism. If you're not familiar, mercantilism was an economic system designed entirely to extract wealth from the colonies just to enrich the European home countries. And this came at a terrible, virtually incalculable cost to the indigenous populations.
And look, this impact wasn't just a temporary blip. It forged incredibly deep, permanent cultural, linguistic, and economic shifts worldwide. If you've ever wondered why Portuguese is spoken in Brazil, why English is a primary language in India, or why certain global trade routes still operate the exact way they do today, well, this is exactly why. Our modern world was literally forged in the crucible of this 500-year era.
Finally, we arrive at Part 5, Post-WW2 Decolonization, the end of the era.
For half a millennium, the absolute defining global structure was imperial rule. But the aftermath of World War II served as the ultimate breaking point. The sheer devastation and totally shifting political realities following that global conflict sparked a massive worldwide decolonization movement. Over a remarkably short period of time, this wave led to the independence of most colonies, effectively closing the book on the traditional colonial era.
So we've traced the rise of these empires, their motivations, their specific methods of control, and their ultimate dismantling. But history never really ends, does it? The big question we're left with is this: how do the cultural, linguistic, and economic shifts of this 500-year period continue to invisibly define our modern borders and markets today? The next time you look at a world map, or even just read the global financial news, try viewing it through the lens of the incredible history we just explored. Thanks